We welcome Rebekah Paxton to the stream. She's the research director for the Employment Policies Institute. And Rebekah, I always like to start these interviews by introducing myself. I'm Connor. We've only connected via email thus far, so it's nice to kind of meet you on live television here.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you for having me on.
We really appreciate you being here. And with so much news now, both globally and here in Virginia, it's easy to miss all of the little things that change as a new administration takes over. One of those things is Virginia businesses kind of gearing up to get to that $15 an hour wage. It's a Virginia minimum wage hike with a $12.77 minimum wage that went into effect this January, $15 an hour, set to take effect by January 1st, 2028. So a minimum wage hike coming for Virginians that will sort of increasingly move forward until it reaches $15 an hour if all plans are in effect by January 1st of 2028. I just want to get, before we dive into specifics, your general reaction when you see news like this.
Yeah, so we saw that the governor signed the $15 minimum wage increase. This is something that the state has tried before, and our organization has been studying this issue for over 3 decades. Economists have certainly been studying this issue for longer than that. We always want to remind folks that higher pay is always a good thing. We want people to get paid more. However, a lot of times these mandates specifically come with a lot of economic trade-offs that can be bad for workers, can be bad for local businesses.
What are some of those trade-offs? How will this impact local businesses in a way that could be detrimental?
Yeah, so the research, again, going back decades, shows that, as minimum wages go up, the cost to employers has to get adjusted somewhere. So they either raise prices, they may lay off staff, they may reduce some staff scheduling. So even if they don't get laid off, they may have fewer hours. They may find it really difficult to operate in general, and they may have to shut down. And certainly, when we speak to economists in general, they generally agree that it does cost jobs, it does cost businesses, and ultimately can actually contribute to rising inflation.
If we see a situation where as inflation has gone up over the course of those decades where these studies have been happening, and that potentially could have a lot of situations at businesses where before these wage hikes, perhaps employees were underpaid, which I guess would in theory mean that those businesses were profiting off of those lower wages for their workforce. Is this not, are there not situations where this would simply fill in that gap and it wouldn't necessarily lead to those drastic consequences? And why wouldn't that be something that we see maybe more frequently than the negative consequences?
Sure. Well, let me just say, the inflation has certainly risen over the last few decades. However, we did the math, and Virginia's minimum wage actually already outpaces the rise in inflation since the federal minimum wage changed back in 2009. So already Virginia is ahead of where inflation would put the current value of the 2009 federal minimum wage. However, businesses have to make up for these changes. When the government mandates something that businesses have to do, they have to change their operations because the minimum wage is going up, but that doesn't necessarily mean sales are going up, which is what they use to pay their employees and pay for their operating costs. So businesses are going to have to make adjustments. A lot of business owners want to do right by their employees, but of course they also have to stick to the numbers and what they can afford to pay folks. And so when the government steps in, we find this gap between what businesses are able to afford and what they have to adapt to afford. And unfortunately, that's when you start to see these negative consequences come into play. So it could be smaller businesses, it could be large businesses, but there's significant evidence that even raising the minimum wage to 15 has had serious job impacts, especially for teens, especially for low profit margin industries like restaurants. And so it's hard to say that folks wouldn't see some sort of impact from this law.
I want to dive into those specific examples you gave there. Did you say teens as one that could see a lot of impacts? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we look at the demographics of folks who are typically earning the minimum wage, and this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a large portion of those folks are younger workers, teenagers, entry-level folks, and also folks who are working part-time. So it's hard to put a pinpoint on who is earning the minimum wage because a lot of people are in these types of jobs for different reasons. They might be in college, they might be, supplementing income. And so teens and entry-level workers who maybe haven't been working as long, have fewer skills than someone who's more seasoned in the workforce, they might be the first folks to lose out on job opportunities because now that the minimum wage is much higher, employers may be looking for folks who can do more in the workplace off the bat. They don't have to train them as much, because now the cost of work per hour is going up.
Okay, and then you mentioned restaurants in particular. I'm wondering, what other industries are particularly susceptible to what could be negative consequences from this minimum wage increase?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the hospitality industry makes up the most minimum wage earners. So this increase will most directly affect those hospitality businesses. And again, places like restaurants, hotels, which typically have smaller or more volatile profit margins and revenue margins, especially given sort of the seasonality of some of those industries, may have a harder time sort of adapting to these larger wage mandates.
And, when I hear some of the things that we're kind of working through right now, and, what I'm about to ask you is probably very anecdotal and reductive, and there are unintended consequences anytime you try to get too, kind of creative like this. But I'm wondering, having talked to you here, would it be more effective to create more structured increases where perhaps once you get to 21, now it's $15 an hour required, or for hospitality industries, only in the month of June through September is it $15 an hour, and in the off season it's actually less for hospitality industries. I mean, are these things that are considered by economists as possible solutions to both increase wages but also maintain sort of stability for businesses?
It's an interesting concept. I mean, I think the more flexibility businesses can have while also abiding by the law, which again, I want to emphasize, most employers are law-abiding operators and aren't trying to cheat anyone out of pay or, anything like that. They want to do well by their employees and their customers, and they want to stay in business. But it's actually interesting that the United Kingdom has actually adopted quite a complex minimum wage system, in part because of some scholars in the United States that tried to export this minimum wage mandate structure over in the UK. And they have this vastly complicated system where people of different ages, people of different skill sets, people in different industries have different minimum wages. And what they're finding is that, again, youth jobs, folks trying to enter the workforce, entry-level folks are out of a job or can't find work. And they actually have a huge unemployment crisis right now. So they have tried something like that. Obviously, the UK isn't the same as the US necessarily, or Virginia for that matter. But, it's certainly a cautionary tale to the more mandates and the more layers of mandates that you put on businesses, make it harder for them to operate. And it also makes it harder for them to plan raises and things for their employees. So our position and what we talk about with economists is, more flexibility for businesses to be able to set wages for their employees and give raises is probably the best case scenario.
And then, a theory that I have heard in the past that is an argument maybe more in favor of an elevated minimum wage is, especially when we talk about hospitality, restaurants, hotels, travel, tourism, recreational spending, if everybody has more money to spend, then even if there is a sort of a short-term disruption, ultimately people will have more resources to spend on going out to restaurants and having weekends in hotels and making trips where they're spending on recreation. When it comes to that theory, is that something feasible that could sort of nullify that short-term suffering for a lot of businesses, particularly in that industry?
Well, certainly good economic times are going to be better than bad economic times for folks spending money, like you mentioned. But one thing that we actually surveyed economists on was how do minimum wages impact the cost of living? And we found that at a $15 minimum wage, like the one that was just signed for Virginia, 59% of economists say that it would actually increase the cost of living for folks in affected areas. Again, because prices have to be higher to accommodate higher wages. And there's some evidence to back this up. Studies have been done over decades that show minimum wage hikes actually contribute to rising food prices, rising childcare, even potentially rising rent. So, again, while we're so in favor of folks making more money and as much money as they possibly can, with minimum wage mandates like this, are we actually eroding the purchasing power of those higher wages by, having downstream inflationary effects?
Right. Okay. Okay. I gotcha. And then, can we talk about where automation factors into all of this? Obviously, you've really kind of laid out how a $15 minimum wage could lead to more unemployment, but automation is obviously maybe the most heavily focused on factor for potential future unemployment. How does that make its way into this equation? And I want to add sort of an extra layer of people making more money will only become more necessary as automation takes more jobs, I think, is maybe a theory that I've heard posited, is that the minimum wage should go up as there is more automation so that people can afford to work less because there will be less work to do. And so I know I kind of threw a lot at you right there, but your summary of how automation is such a major factor in this.
Yeah, so from a theoretical perspective, again, as costs are rising, employers have a decision to make. And I'm not a business operator, so I don't want to speak for anyone. But in theory, right, if the cost per hour of employing folks goes up, it may become more cost effective to invest one time in technology that allows you to sort of remove some of those employment opportunities. We're seeing rises in things like self-service kiosks, AI drive-throughs, fewer people up at the front of a fast food restaurant. You put in your order on a tablet, all kinds of things like that that are sort of replacing person jobs. And so, we're seeing this in places like California, where they just raised the minimum wage for fast food workers up to 20 an hour. The statewide minimum wage is more than 16 an hour. And we're seeing, folks who keep their jobs, they may still be employed, but they actually have fewer hours at that higher wage rate. So they actually, potentially aren't making as much money as they were before under the lower minimum wage mandate. And to your point about, folks should be paid more because there's less work to do. I think that's really the crux of it, right? Is if there's less work to do, a business doesn't have to hire as many employees. Again, mandating higher wages is going to create this kind of snowball effect, right? The higher the cost of having a person in a job goes, the turn to automation may be even more severe. And, again, we asked economists, what do you think will be the consequences for automation under a $15 minimum wage, like in Virginia? And 71% said that there would be an increase in automation. So this is not something that's sort of theoretical. Economists have studied it, thought about it. And it's a very real trade-off for some of these minimum wage mandates.
And you summarized kind of like my rambling approach to the statement in a way that was so concise. And I know how paradoxical that sounds, right? Literally paid more because there's less work to do. There is an inherent hypocrisy within that sort of statement, but the situation we are in is relatively unique when it comes to the advent of automation. Okay, so I'm wondering if we are in an affordability crisis and simply giving people higher wages is something that certain economists feel is going to lead to more unintended consequences than benefits. Has the Employment Policies Institute, is there a substitute that you guys think is sort of a easier approach to this that could be more beneficial for everyone, that could maybe take the place of a wage hike like this?
Sure. So there's plenty of government policies that actually boost or supplement workers' wages without putting the onus on the employer to pay out higher hourly costs. Things like child tax credits, earned income tax credits, general welfare benefits for those who are seriously experiencing poverty and lower income. Those types of things can all add to a worker's hourly wages without, forcing the employer to sort of make up money that he doesn't have to pay them. So it's sort of a win-win for the worker and for the business. But also, again, I mentioned flexibility and getting rid of barriers to operating for businesses that are common sense. The less hoops that a business owner has to jump through, the less, fees and taxes and all kinds of stuff that makes it really hard and costly to run a business. Getting rid of some of those outrageous ones potentially could free up more of that margin to make sure that they can keep paying their employees and make sure they can give them raises when they want to. Because again, a lot of these folks are small businesses, large businesses. They want to retain their employees. It's valuable to have employees who know the business and know the work and are good at the work and want to stay. And so by being able to provide raises when they are financially able to, will actually do more for boosting workers' wages instead of sort of mandating these increases that business owners may or may not be able to afford.
Okay, so many questions, so many answers to come in the years that lie ahead, but a number of answers for us here today on Live Impact News from Rebekah Paxton. Rebekah, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us, to lend some insight into this, and to continue to focus on all of the different changes that are coming to Virginia and the U.S., as there's so many different things for everyone to pay attention to. I also really appreciate the fact that throughout the course of our time together, you made sure to emphasize that, look, we want everyone to have lots of money, but while continuing to break down the ways in which that could happen. So is there anything else you want to add, Rebekah?
I would just say, to the Virginia policymakers and leaders, continue to look at case studies, continue to look at the experts on what they say about this, because there's a lot of emotional arguments. But what we've seen in a lot of other places is that these wage hikes could backfire on workers and businesses. So just keep those economist perspectives, those expert perspectives, and of course, workers and local businesses as well.
Okay, Rebekah Paxton, Research Director for the Employment Policies Institute. We appreciate the time, and hopefully we'll see you again as more and more changes come to our economy.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.